hopefully everyone is familiar with April's work. They're worked near you for a while now. I think I'm smart enough to work with you. But there were a few things that I learned about April when I was preparing to introduce her today. The first is that the name April used to be more popular, but it's now been overtaken by June and May. I was only able to find 2 other April Resides on Facebook, and you're the only one on LinkedIn. You don't know this, but a while back, when I was asked to water some of your plants, I stole a banana tree. It's very happy, but it's not productive.
I told him not to embarrass me.
But unlike your banana tree, you've been very productive here at the center. And your research includes all of the best keywords like climate change, spatial modeling, refugia, novel methods, rainforest, and threatened species. So I think, yeah, and I think we can add policy and law onto that list after today.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to be presenting a version of this at the Ecological Society conference, and so I'm sorry to tell you all that you're the guinea pigs for this talk. And yeah, I'd be interested to hear your feedback. Probably the feedback will be, it's too long and you ranted too much, but I feel like I quite excel at ranting, so that's my strong point. But yes, I'm aiming it to you guys, but I also want to aim it to the 600 odd scientists that might be at the ESA conference. And so hopefully I've got it pitched right. And I apologise to all those in the room that have already heard me rant about Blackberry finches, probably on multiple occasions. Okay, so basically the talk that I want to give today is to just pretty much say these 4 things. The first is that Australia is not doing a very good job at preventing biodiversity decline, and that's even in the context of a global decline. We're actually doing quite a lot worse than a lot of other places. Our current laws do not safeguard our species, and there are examples of places in the world that do it much better than what we do. It's not just, that these things are impossible. Right now, today, we have a chance to change Australia's environmental law, and that ecologists need to be in that discussion. Now, I come from an ecology background, so of course I think ecology is the most important thing ever, but I think, we need conservation scientists, social scientists, physical scientists, like people that just know how the world works to be in these discussions as well. So starting with the first topic, I'll try not to be really depressing. Sorry if I do get a bit depressing, but I think that we do need to know the context in which these laws are operating in. And basically, everyone that actually works in conservation is under no illusion about the fact we're doing a really bad job of preventing decline, and some people are even using words like extinction crisis. And we know that, but we can see by the decisions that are being made at higher levels that not everybody knows that, and this is a story that we need to try and make sure people are hearing. So the IPBES report that came out earlier this year came up with some pretty sobering figures, and actually I put this slide in because I wanted an excuse to put one of my Africa photos in my talk. I needed a global slide. So 75% of the Earth's land surface is significantly altered. At least 85% of the wetlands global area has been lost, and around a quarter of the species that have been assessed are threatened with extinction. And you can see I'm very terrestrial, so I'm only really talking about terrestrial systems here. And Australia is particularly bad. So we've had one of the worst records for extinction of anywhere in the globe. Most of those extinct species are plants. That's probably why you haven't really probably heard of a lot of those. We're also leading the world for mammal extinctions in contemporary times. Birds, not so good either. Frogs, and probably a whole bunch of invertebrates. But I think the thing that, and again, probably this room, we probably know this, but what people that aren't studying conservation science don't necessarily understand is that the extinction curve isn't flattening off. We had lots of extinctions in Australia as the land started to be modified 50 years ago, 100 years ago, but that is continuing. And we've had 3 vertebrates go extinct in Australian territories since 2009, at least 3. So it's happening now, it's happening while I've been working as a conservation scientist. And so John Wanowski tallied all of Australia's extinctions across since European settlement from what we know, to find that extinction rate is fairly solid, and his paper just came out a few days ago, which is pretty much a bit more explanation and data on that same plot. That we are losing species at a steady rate, and we're not able to flatten that curve just yet. Now Australia, has really high endemism. We have a whole bunch of species that are found nowhere else in the world, and yet we're just not spending the comparative amount of money that would be required to actually protect those species. And so one figure is that we've actually seen a reduction in the environmental spending done by the federal government of 65% since 2013. Does anyone know what happened in 2013? Yeah, we got a change of government. We got the Conservatives in, and they slashed environment funding. And that's projected, that's still going down. And so we're actually going down in the proportion that's being spent. We have a very low proportion of our GDP that's spent on the environment compared to other countries. And we just have so many amazing species. And so we've got so much, we're spending so little. So the gap's even wider than it would be if we even had a comparative number of species. And so one of the things we need to argue is a genuine investment to our biodiversity to even just get up to the level of the other OECD countries. So my next point, our current laws do not safeguard our species. Now's my time to talk particularly about the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And this is the main one because this is the one that gets a statutory review every 10 years, and we're up for its 20-year review, and that's happening right now, and that's what I want to convince you that we all need to be involved in. I'll also touch on Queensland's Vegetation Management Act, the state law, because that one is also a big player in a lot of the clearing and decline that's happened in Queensland that's relevant to this story. Now I get to rant about my favourite finch, Blackberry finch, and I'll touch on this at the end. But the other thing I wanted to convince you is that you should all go online and vote for the Blackberry finch in the Guardian's online poll.
But it's rigged.
Yeah. It is rigged. That's okay, as long as it's rigged in favour of Blackberry finch. So Blackberry finch, it's a pretty innocuous little bird, I think. It's super cute. But if you were to read our nationwide paper, you would think that this bird is responsible for the ending of Australia's economy, just about. It has been getting a lot of press, which is why I think it should be Bird of the Year, because it's been through a bit of a rough time in the last 12 months and beyond. But yes, there's been a whole lot of press about this, one little bird that could derail an entire mine and all of Queensland's economic development and employment, and you name it, this little bird is responsible. And it's quite telling about how you might frame the science that's going on. How many articles do you have to publish in the peer-reviewed scientific literature before you're labelled as an ornithologist or a scientist and not an anti-coal activist? I don't publish on anti-coal, I publish on birds and conservation, but anyway, that's what the Murdoch press seems to think. Okay, so the Blackberry finch story, and hopefully if you haven't already heard this before, you'll be excited, and if you have heard it before, you'll be even more excited. I do talk about it a lot. So Blackberry finches used to occur from north of Townsville, so we're talking about northeastern Australia for people that aren't Australian. So up towards the tip of Australia, all the way down into northern New South Wales, so a really large area. But since the year 2000, they've only been recorded in a much smaller subset of that original range. And so it's lost pretty much, we're estimating that now they've lost around 80 to 88% of that original extent based on pre-clear mapping. And so it's now presumed extinct in New South Wales, and it hasn't been seen in southeast Queensland reliably for probably since before the 70s. And I mean, it's not a big surprise. This area has been so heavily modified, it has been heavily cleared, and a whole bunch of other species that are relying on similar woodland habitats in this area have also disappeared. That's where the paradise parrot's gone extinct. There's a bunch of other little finches that have declined from this area. So it's highly modified, and so it's kind of no surprise that they've lost that habitat. So we've reconstructed where we think that habitat would have been based on the ecosystem types, where those locations are, and that's what we think maybe the pre-European distribution would have been. Oopsie, wrong button. And in the year 2000, we think that's what they had left. And this is an important date because that's when this federal law came into operation. So the year 2000, what we were interested in this paper is, since that law has come in, what has it meant for the black-throated finch? Well, it hasn't meant a whole lot for habitat protection for the poor little black-throated finch. It has lost quite a substantial amount of habitat, even since it's been listed under that law. So when the law came in, it was already listed as vulnerable. 5 years later, it was uplisted to endangered, and yet habitat still keeps being lost. And of course, being an ecologist, I use lots of words like, we think this is where their range is, we've tried to reconstruct lots of these clarifying language, because it's really hard to know where they are, because the intersection of what's happening with that land at any one time, the rainfall that's happened in the previous months and years, will determine how much food there is, so how many grass seeds happen to be available. And so if this patch has no grass seeds, they're going to fly over here. So that doesn't mean that this patch is no longer useful. It might be useful next year, in 10 years, in a really extreme dry and a really extreme wet, but they're just not here right now. So it's really difficult to just put an area around it and say, well, that's their habitat, because we don't really understand what they're using and why. What we suspect is that because almost all of this country is under cattle grazing, the productivity is much reduced. They're competing with the cows for those grasses, but also there's invasive grasses that are coming in and competing for space and interrupting that ground layer. So we think this is where their habitat is, but at any one point they're unlikely to be in most of that. They're moving around to where that food is available, which means getting a defined habitat extent at any one time is also really difficult. So the year 2000 was when the Ebc Act was introduced. It was also when the Queensland Vegetation Management Act also came in. So these two big pieces of legislation that are really affecting black-throated finches coming in at the same time. And so black-throated finch was listed as vulnerable when the Act came in, and then uplisted to endangered. A few years after that, it had a recovery plan that was written, how we're going to recover black-throated finch, and also a recovery team was established. So it's recognised under national law, under Queensland law, under New South Wales law as endangered and now presumed extinct for New South Wales. And there's all these plans and there's a team, but there's no funding to implement the plan. So, plans aren't that useful when you have no ability to implement them. And crucially, the habitat is still being cleared, and there's still a lot of pending applications to clear their habitat right now. So does everyone know about the Ebc Act? Some of our visitors might not know, but I don't want to labour this too much if this is old news for people that have seen it.
Just say what the letters stand for those people.
Yes. Okay, so I'm talking about the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And basically how the Act works is you list threatened species and threatened ecological communities under critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable. Now, if a species has its listing and then someone wants to go and impact that species, if that impact is going to become a significant impact, and there's guidelines to determine what a significant impact might be, then you have to then go to the federal government to say, can I go ahead with my action? So one of the ways that the Act misses some of these developments is that the proponent, the developer, can decide themselves, will I have a significant impact on that threatened species? Nah, pretty sure I won't. and they can just not refer their action. Now, if they think, well, look, I better put it through, you know, I might get in trouble if I don't, then they go through this referral process to the Commonwealth Government. And then if a significant impact is likely, then the next step is to go through a process of having a controlled action. So that might mean avoiding really important areas. It might mean creating an offset to offset any areas that are impacted. And there's a detailed process. But some of these actions could go through this referral process, and then the Commonwealth process might then conclude that there won't be a significant impact, and they say, no, it's not a controlled action, approved, go ahead. So that's roughly how it works. And then the controlled action might just be approved, no conditions, or it might be approved with conditions, and there are a few select cases in which the decision was, no, we've not approved. But even if you get here with your action, your development, then you can just, you know, rework your plan and then go through that process again. And that's often what happens. You just go and address the concerns, resubmit, and go through. Okay, and so this is what I and a few others here in this group looked at for Black-throated finch. How many development projects that were likely to impact Black-throated finch actually went through this process? Thankfully, the Commonwealth Government have a publicly available register. You can just jump online and have a look at all the projects and all the decisions and all the dates of those decisions and who signed off. All that information is available. You can download it and you can interrogate it should you have the time and inclination. That's the spatial database. Again, publicly available. You can download it and say, well, how many projects were referred? This is just Queensland, so that's not the rest of Australia. It's just referred projects within Queensland terrestrial zone. And so I intersected that with where we think the black-throated finch habitat was in the year 2000 to try and understand, well, how many of those projects could have possibly cleared black-throated finch habitat. And I knew it was a lot, but I had no idea that it was going to be over 700 different development projects since the year 2000 that intersected where we think black-throated finch habitat was in the year 2000. Now, I guess the caveat here is that if there was black-throated finch habitat in the year 2000, but then the development was proposed in 2017, well, maybe they're not there anymore. So that's one caveat with that about this work. But I would argue, if it's an endangered species, you probably should check, right? You should probably go through that process if it was an endangered species habitat 10 years ago, and possibly could be. And so of those 775 referred projects, so they're the projects that went through that decision tree, most of them were approved as a not controlled action, which means no conditions, go ahead, do your project, no problem. Less than half were approved as controlled actions. That means that they were still approved to go ahead, but there were some conditions around what they were allowed to do. And amazingly, there were 3 projects that were designated as clearly unacceptable. So the Environment Minister at the time, people here might know the name Peter Garrett. We had an Environment Minister who decided that we're going to turn down development applications. There was one that was actually turned down on the grounds of an unacceptable impact to black-throated finch. A little housing development near Townsville, and they said, no, you can't build your house. And can you imagine the uproar in Townsville? It was when I first arrived in Townsville, front page of the Townsville Bulletin. Pregnant lady with shingles can't build dream third investment property because of stupid bird. And as you can imagine, Townsville was overwhelmingly in favour of the investment property over the endangered species. But I guess the important thing here is it's possible, it has been done. A minister could say, no, that's important habitat for an endangered species, you can't clear it. Clearly that is not a popular way to go about these things. So what this shows is that the Ebc Act has a mechanism to decide whether habitat of an endangered species should or shouldn't be impacted. Most of the time they say yes, go ahead. Most of the time they say yes, go ahead without any conditions.
What type of things are the black bits?
Yeah, so in the database, projects that are completed withdrawn, so you don't know what that decision was. most of them were approved, the project's gone ahead, the project's completed, but it's a government database, so they only have the information that they need, not the information we need. So there's all these things like withdrawn, completed, and you don't know what that decision was. Yeah, most of them were approved. And when some of them didn't go ahead because of financing, there was a whole bunch of different categories in there. You could probably interrogate that, but I didn't. I think one of these there were 3 here. One was a housing development, one was a pipeline or a road or something to Shoalwater Bay. But I think the 3 was because, yeah, they went. But I didn't go through each one of those 775, unfortunately, to get the details. So the next question I asked of this then, well, so that's where all those referred projects occurred, and most of those went ahead. Was there any black-throated finch habitat that was cleared that didn't go through that EPBC referral process? So endangered species habitat got cleared since the law was in place. The feds didn't have any oversight. And that number was 50,000 hectares of black-throated finch habitat was cleared that didn't end up going through that formal referral process. And so basically what this means is that we've got a law, sometimes it's used and sometimes it's not, but basically the habitat's being cleared either way. So, is this law having any impact on what might have happened anyway? Well, I don't know, I haven't got a counterfactual in there, but it certainly is letting a lot of habitat be cleared. This little spot here, can anyone guess why I've highlighted this little patch of referred projects? There's a whole bunch of big thermal coal mines that are proposed. That's a gully basin in that area. If you're ever lucky enough to go out there, hopefully you will get to see some of the biggest flocks in the world of the black-throated finch. Biggest flocks ever recorded. It's just absolutely, it's phenomenal. It's like something that you just cannot see anywhere else in the world. This is the northern end of the proposed Adani Carmichael coal mine. On holiday and accidentally took the road and drove through the mine site. Whoops. And there were just these massive flocks of finches just flying across the road. It was just, yeah, it's really, really amazing. And so Stanley Tang here is a PhD student at JCU. He went along and he took this photograph and he saw flocks of 400. We've never seen flocks of that size anywhere. But, you can't really deny that it is, the best habitat that we know of because they're there in such large numbers so consistently. What we hypothesise for the habitat being so good is that it's got a history of really light grazing. It's got naturally this poison bush, Gastrolobum grandiflorum, that's poisonous to stock, so cows can't eat it, so farmers just don't put their cows there because they might die from this bush. So it's got a history of really low land use and low grazing. There's lots of great ground cover, there's not a whole lot of buffel grass, it's in really good condition. And you're starting to see not just black-throated finches, but plump-headed finches and squatter pigeons and a whole bunch of other things that are fairly common elsewhere. Cool spot, even for grey-fronted honeyeaters. So the federal government has approved 5 of these mega coal mines for the Gully Basin each, which would remove substantial amounts of high-quality black-throated finch habitat, and they've all had this approved. There's a whole bunch of other mines. I believe last count there was about 14 mines approved for that area. 14 mines proposed for that area. Most are, it's a long stage of going through all that paperwork. In the wings we've got Alpha North, and so Carmichael Mine, Adani's project, it gets all the press because it's the biggest mine. When it was first proposed, it was going to be the biggest mine in the Southern Hemisphere. They can't get financing, they cut it down, it's going to be smaller. Alpha North is going to be double the size, at least double the size of the Adani Carmichael mine and double the coal output. And it will also bulldoze half of the beautiful Bimblebox Nature Refuge. Hasn't got all its proofs yet, it's a little bit slower on all of the paperwork. So, yeah, there's a whole bunch of area out there that have been slated for clearing. And it's not just Gully Basin. Around Townsville there's at least 3 new housing developments, road upgrades, sugarcane farms, 3 solar farms for black-throated finch habitat around Townsville. You name it, everyone wants a piece of black-throated finch habitat. But I think it's an important question. Like, are we just talking about this just really unlucky little bird, and actually most of our other species are fine? Well, Michelle did this amazing study, and I don't know how she managed to get all of this done, but she actually looked at every single one of our terrestrial threatened species, which was, what, 1,800. Like, I did it for one species and I thought I did a great job. Michelle's gone and done it for 1,800 species, which is just phenomenal. To look at, well, you know, what does this mean for all the other species since the year 2000 when the Act began? And she found that actually 85% of those species had lost habitat since the Act began. So it's not just Blackberry Finch, it's most species. And it equated for 7.7 million hectares of terrestrial threatened species. And that's not like recounting the same hectare, that's like just counting each hectare once, assuming there could be, you know, lots and lots of threatened species there. And the blue habitat, which you probably can't see, there's a little bit here. The blue is where it went through that referral process that I mentioned, the formal federal process. And the red is where that clearing happened that never went through that process. It just got cleared without asking the federal government, am I allowed to clear? And when you just glance at this map, it might be hard at that resolution, but you can kind of tell where all the red is overwhelmingly. That's good old Queensland. But, you know, in Queensland's defence, if you want to put it that way, you know, a lot of what was clearable and agriculturally suitable in a lot of other states had already been cleared a long time ago. We're just thinking about clearing since the year 2000. Turns out Queensland's got a lot of area that could be cleared. So sorry, Michelle, I've added in some more of your work because it's just so brilliant. And it looks at all of the different industries and how many referrals per industry. And I think it's also really important, you know, the mining industry are just getting all this flack and they want to clear Blackberry Finch habitat, and we're really, really pointing the finger at them. The mining industry are really compliant. They go through the process. They actually go to the federal government and say, can I clear it? This is what I want to do. The agricultural industry have very, very few referrals. And so they're the ones that are clearing the vast majority of that area across Queensland, and they're not going through that process. So that's agriculture and forestry together. So yes, mining is taking away some important threatened species habitat, but if we're talking about just sheer amount of threatened species habitat being cleared, it's agricultural industry that aren't even bothering to engage with that process. So another postdoc here, Jeremy Simmons, his project that a bunch of us were involved with, and he looked at, again, you know, is the Blackberry Finch an isolated case? Well, he found that 4 times more species went from vulnerable to a higher category, just like Blackberry Finch started off in vulnerable and then declined so that it fit these other categories. 4 times more went in that direction than the opposite direction, from a high category back down to vulnerable or delisted. So again, not an isolated case. We list things as vulnerable, we keep clearing their habitat, then they get more and more threatened. And there's Queensland's Vegetation Management Act and the impact of it, and there's a whole lot of politics that has gone along with the high rates of clearing, low rates of clearing, and then high rates of clearing again. So we've got a state election coming up in Queensland next year. It looks like we may not get the same government in again. The current government is for stronger protections on native vegetation. The rumour is that we're very likely to get a change of government, and that new government is very likely to want to just wipe this legislation off. And in fact, the agricultural lobby is actively lobbying to just throw this act out altogether, just get rid of it. So, yes, interesting times. Okay, now in terms of that intersection between the agricultural industry out there clearing and not going through the federal process, there were a few cases where there was some high profile clearing of large areas in some really important places that were done by farmers, by landholders, and the compliance in the federal government went, oh, I guess we should probably intervene, that's pretty bad. They didn't refer big impacts to threatened species. They wrote letters to the landholders to say, you haven't gone through this process, we need to investigate. But then the sitting members of parliament of those electorates went in so hard in defence of the landholders in their area that the federal government just backed away. And so even when the federal government tried to enact some compliance over clearing that could by rights be argued as illegal, the political climate just would not let that through. This again was all happening in Queensland. And frighteningly, the Northern Territory again has a whole lot that could be lost because it has so little clearing that's happened, but the land clearing is just starting to ramp up now. So the Northern Territory is the next frontier that we've got to watch. And so just a quick overview of the thinking behind environmental controls, and this is some of Megan Evans' work. I think I stole this from Megan Evans' paper. That basically we had this history of we're thinking about the environment and environmental protection, vegetation management, because we needed to protect our soil. Without healthy soil, we can't grow any food, and we need to be really careful of salinity because salinity is destroying vast areas of agricultural land. But in the 1990s, there was more of a push towards just protecting the environment because the environment's just important, not because it's about food or soil. And then there was a decade that was a bit more focused on the command and control and around let's legislate, let's try and end this broad-scale land clearing. And it was a really exciting time because we're getting real gains and time to crack the champagne. But then the backlash against that was, well, we need to do some clearing, so maybe we can just offset the clearing that we do, sort of relax some of those protections. Let's just ask the landholder whether they think they should clear or not. Let's have a self-assessable process, which happened in a few places. And now, we're about to start the decade of the 2020s, and we're going through this law reform right now. So now is the time to set the conversation around that. I wanted to briefly touch on the offsets, and I'm probably talking too much, so I should probably just rush through this, but I just wanted to point out that there is no evidence that offsets are going to mitigate the biodiversity decline if we keep clearing like we're clearing. Very few offset projects have a true kind of control experiment so we can actually tell whether they've done something to mitigate decline. The ones that have had a counterfactual and done a bit more of a structured investigation were all done in places with good governance and good funding and transparent developed countries. And this review that came out earlier this year looked at all of these and found that there were no offsets that could achieve a no net loss in a terrestrial ecosystem. So basically, if you clear or impact some area and then you offset to mitigate that impact, there's no example of doing that where you haven't ended up with a loss of biodiversity. So I'm going to, and my point that I want to make here is that we need to be really honest about what offsets can achieve. Okay, maybe not saying that we don't use offsets, but just don't pretend that they're going to work, that they're going to mitigate decline. Actually say if we're going to offset, this is the decline that we'll see. Right, so I argue that we need environmental laws that prevent habitat loss for endangered species if we're going to prevent their decline. And right now, we have a chance to change the law. So, the Statutory Review of Australia's Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act was announced last month, and the review will consist of a specialist expert in public policy in economic reform and regulation, and there'll be a panel. There'll be a traditional owner from Arakoon and Cape York. There'll be a geologist with 40 years experience in minerals and petroleum, a policy advisor with experience in natural resource management, and an environmental law and policy expert who I've been told they're all have amazing expertise in their fields. However, I'd like to point out it's a Biodiversity Conservation Act, and I would argue you'd want someone with expertise in biodiversity and or conservation to be involved in this conversation. So on the website, if you log in, they'll say, for the next 12 months, a review is keen to hear your views and insights on the Ebc Act, how it is operated, the challenges ahead it should address, and your ideas for the future. All Australians are invited to participate. We expect a discussion paper in the next few weeks on what this review panel think about the law, about the previous statutory review that happened in 2009. Somewhere that will be opened up for submissions, and I guess we'll try and coordinate a response from CBCS, so people are interested in being involved in that. I think that would be a really important thing to be involved in, and then we'll find out by October 2020 the findings of the review panel. Now, this is really frightening for anyone that hadn't already seen this. This was an article that was in the Financial Review last week from our Environment Minister, Federal Environment Minister, on this law reform. So she's announced to the business community it is the season to slash green tape. And for those people who haven't been paying attention to the Australian discussion around this, you know, there's this idea of red tape, there's all this bureaucracy between me and what I want to do. Well, now in Australia we talk a lot about the green tape, that's all the environmental protections that are in the way of what we want to do. And so our Environment Minister has announced it is the season to slash the green tape. And, you know, she makes some nice statements about it's really important to, you know, we all love the environment, we need to protect it. But, you know, the review of the Act will play a significant role across a wide range of sectors, such as agriculture. We've just seen that agriculture don't even interact with this law. Like, they don't refer any projects to this law. And when there's an attempt at compliance, that was shut down as well. So agriculture isn't really affected. Mining and infrastructure. The wide range of sectors in agriculture, mining and infrastructure. There's a whole lot more sectors that are interested in biodiversity conservation. Yes, so it's a little bit frightening to think that our Environment Minister sees the review of the Act in this light. And I argue that if we're not in the room stating the case for why we need to protect biodiversity and why the law isn't doing a good job, then I'm not convinced that the agriculture business and governments are going to, you know the case. Okay, so why do ecologists play a crucial role? It's an amazing group of environmental law experts wrote the blueprint for what they believe that this law should do and what it should look like. And it's really amazing. I encourage you to jump on the EPL website and have a look, because I don't know that much about law reform and how these things work. They do, it's really amazing. But again, they're lawyers, and when you chat to these lawyers, and I've been in fora with these groups, and I'm the only person that uses the name of the species. They don't, bird, frog, tree, what? That's not how they think. That's not what they know or understand. And when I've talked to these people individually, they say, we need your science. We don't know what to do with this law until you tell us what this means. They don't understand how offsets are going to impact a particular species or ecosystem. We're the ones that need to help inform that process. And so it will be the ecologists that can point out the perverse outcomes of a decision. It will be the ecologists that could actually investigate what the offset is going to do, what it might actually mean. You know, this idea that we can clear a patch of habitat and in 2 years' time secure an offset. Like, that's actually in Adani's Carmichael coal mine offset plan, that they just need to secure the offset within 2 years of starting to clear the habitat. So as an ecologist, you can see that's crazy. Where are the birds going to live for 2 years while they think about securing their offset? But the regulators have put that in the plan and approved it. I think it's fine. And so the whole environmental impact assessment process needs people with expertise in conservation and ecology to inform what that needs to look like. The Ecological Society of Australia has been calling for some really strong environmental benefits to a revised Act, but we really need people with expertise in the species and how they interact with the threats and the different ecological contexts. And it's the ecologists that are going to inform the site-based decisions that are going to be really important. I can tell you what I think. I'm sure you've probably gathered that by now, but in terms of black-throated finch, we need a genuine protection for habitat. So if we're going to protect the black-throated finch, then we need to say, no, you cannot clear that area. And we need to evaluate the impacts in the whole context. 775 referrals to develop black-throated finch habitat. Not one of those was assessed in combination of another. It was this action right here, what's its impact? Not, if we go ahead and clear 80% of its habitat, what will happen? Just assessment at the project scale. So we need to know that whole context. We need to know the context of how these species use the landscape and food availability, drought, refuges, and all the rest. And if we're going to offset, we need to put the offset in place, demonstrate that it works before permitting habitat destruction. That's the only way that we are going to prevent decline, is to actually show that we can offset a black-throated finch habitat patch. Now, there's some anecdotal evidence coming out of some projects that CSIRO are doing in Northern Australia. It can take 30 years for the ground cover in some of these savanna ecosystems to recover after they've been heavily grazed. If you're just going to whack, a fence around the area and call it an offset and walk away, you're just dooming the species to just disappear from that area. So if we genuinely want it not to decline and we want to use offsets, prove that it works first. It's the only way. Unfortunately, they probably won't. Okay, so that's all I have to say, except that you should all go and vote for black-throated finch in the Australian Bird of the Year poll. Okay, thank you, everybody. Martin.
Just another bit of advice politically is it's always two ways, whether you get CBCS doing a joint submission or whether you get lots of individual submissions. I tend to favour the individual, lots of individual, because individual expertise, like in particular species, that if you can write about this species is declined, this habitat's been destroyed, that can be much more powerful because they go by aggregation. In the bureaucrats go by, well, so many submissions said this and so many submissions said that. It's only one submission. Oh, it's just one.
Okay,
so,
interesting.
So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is there's also the Australian National Audit Office. Michelle, are you here?
Yes.
Yes, there you are. Yeah, I sent that to you yesterday.
Yes.
The ANAO have opened an performance audit into referral processes under the Ebc Act. Very important. And certainly the work that Michelle's just published should be in there saying, well, the problem is nothing's referred. Like, that's the big problem. But very important to interact, because the audit office, of course, is arm's length from government, so they can be incredibly powerful. They're unconstrained in their criticism of government. So to get a good result out of the audit office will really set the tone for the Ebc Act review. So please interact as well with the audit office audit that's going on.
You share that, Michelle. Yeah. Thank you. That's good to know.
I've got a comment on environmental lawyers.
Yes.
When I was at CEU, I did this exercise with Vanessa Adams, someone from the Northern Territory Environmental Law Society. They wanted to do a talk to the society on a particular piece of environmental law, and they wanted scientists to have some input. And so we picked this case study of gamba grass management and impacts on ENT. And it was interesting in that, Vanessa could catalogue just like a wealth of ills that come from gamba grass management and that it's not being managed and things like that. But the environmental lawyer did the review of all the legislation kind of independently, and then they were going to co-present one and then the other, and basically went, yeah, it's great legislation, it's watertight.
Yeah.
Like, oh, really, there's a problem? I'm surprised because the legislation's really well drafted.
Yeah.
And so the issue was mainly that it had never, and because it had not been enforced, there was a precedent of not enforcing it, and so you weren't going to be the person who was going to punish the first farmer. And so that is a key issue, particularly if there's anything, it doesn't matter if legislation is watertight, if there's basically an accepted practice of not enforcing it.
That's a really, really nice case study for this point. Yeah, that's really interesting. And, I think the environmental lawyers are doing an amazing job, but they, they're just not.
Frequently don't know. They just go,
don't.
we just assume it works.
Yeah.
Right, The other thing is in the NT, this was a couple of years ago, it might have changed, but there was literally one vegetation management officer for the entire Northern Territory who was supposed to review and assess potential illegal land clearing. So they literally worked on the assumption that they would find one that they could publicly prosecute to create the perception that they were paying attention when they actually had absolutely no capacity to really know what was going on.
And I'm sure they didn't want to be the one to pick the landholder then gets paraded around as the...
Sorry. Great job. I'm taking notes for family. I was thinking on the bar plot where you said like approved, not approved with conditions and not approved. Did you see there's like some patterns in those categories to try to see why some are actually those three have something in common that actually made them not be approved, or what is, if there's some patterns that you can actually work with?
I didn't, but it'd be super interesting. Did you look into that with your work to look at, are there any patterns by what are getting controlled actions or what are not getting controlled actions?
Didn't go into that much detail, no, but that would be interesting to figure out if there are any patterns between controlled and not controlled. I imagine they're more controlled under critical ecological communities. They seem to be more controlled than vulnerable or endangered species.
But that would be super interesting to know. Like, I would imagine there could be a political element, particularly the sectors they're allowed to be mean to, and other sectors, they're a bit more lax with
And
states.
people are also putting in submissions for look into this space because this doesn't look right. Like if people are jobbing on each other, then they have to investigate. So maybe within more green spaces, there might be some sort of electoral division that are, not sure. It'd be interesting though.
Yeah, it'd be a great honours project,
Yeah.
or honours or masters to do a thesis on that, on what drives the difference between controlled and not controlled. Nobody's ever done it. And a paper right there. Yeah.
One open question for the hub would be to, the centre would be to how much they believe in regional planning. So, remember the law says not a significant impact. So, there's habitat for 3,724 finches, then if you take out habitat for 3 or 2, whatever, is that significant? So that's a matter of judgment, which is going to be difficult to ever get around. So, death by 1,000 cuts. So a lot of those things avowedly could be too small. It depends on your perspective. So when NERC was up and running, we spent a lot of time when the Labor government was in doing regional plans. Brendan, Aslan, other people in this room led those regional planning exercises for Western Melbourne, Hunter Valley,
The Perth Bill.
So and the Cumberland Plain woodlands, and some of those were. Cumberland Plain woodland is effective because it was partially successful. $2 billion went into the New South Wales state government coffers to preserve, buy and manage that woodland. But there were losses. So there are the two alternatives. You can fight every hectare, you can fight every mine, and you'll lose slower with stronger legislation. You can force critical habitat, which is completely walled off. But that probably has to be built into the context of a regional plan, and then somebody's going to ask the question, how much is enough? And whether they'll stick to the regional plan and whether they'll lock it up in stone.
To be honest, when I read the paper they did for the Perth Peel region, just, the best that they come up with was instead of, I can't remember the numbers, but it was something like instead of losing 16% of the critically endangered Carnaby black cockatoo area, they're only going to lose 6%. And instead of 30% of this critically endangered species, now their new plan was only going to remove 10%. And I'm like, that's what you achieve with a regional plan, is to go from a terrible situation to a bad situation for a critically endangered species. So
They've been thrown out now, so we're not getting anything.
oh God.
So the bottom line is
That's depressing.
the less routes and vehicles.
So-
Is a regional plan something that we promote, or do we just say that they don't work?
Well, the RFA, I mean, the Regional Forest Agreement was supposed to be that, right? It was supposed to identify the areas we want to keep and the areas that we're going to be open to timber harvesting, and yet we've still seen, greater gliders just drop out of like previously
made
common
vast
species.
areas of national parks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was some success.
The idea of, instead of worrying about each piece as it comes up, arguing where reserves aren't comprehensive, adequate, representative, could be another sort of avenue. Mind you, David Linden might be trying to Victorian Central Highlands for a long time, and he's probably
Might have won it now.
in a much better situation than it was. Well,
With the
Well,
latest
that's it.
announcement, Victoria. So I would like, and I'd be really interested to see your opinion on this, I'd like to see the regional planning done in a way that we go, that was a real win for conservation. And I don't know that we have, but this is
I don't think it'll ever be a real win. It'll be
Yeah.
a less loss.
less loss. But this is a discussion that is being had for the EPBC review, and people are really torn over it, because when it has been done, then we're not getting outcomes that we'd like to see, and so then we could have a problem here. The Queensland government are writing a bioregional management plan for Blackberry Finch, which they're trying to do something like that. But as far as I understand, it's going to be a lot of carving out the development areas and managing everything in between. And so I think they're trying to do that, but the constraints are so great that what can you achieve under?
There's just one last thing I'd like to say is the lawyers will often ask you, and the politicians, as probably you will ask me when we were writing this piece of legislation, how much is enough? And the conservation science can't answer that question, which is why I keep saying more is better. There is no answer to the question, how much is enough? But they'll ask it. So you need to be able to say something sensible. The only fact is more is better, which isn't satisfied. So that's which eventually leads you to a regional plan.
Yeah, and it's interesting, when I was at a forum with Appeal earlier in the year, and I was pushing the case that we need to not have loss of any black-throated finch habitat. They've lost 88%. We need to just retain what they've got left. And it was Phil Gibbon, who was an environmental lawyer at ANU, was just like, oh, come on, you've got to compromise. I'm like, they've lost 88%. They've already done their compromising. At some point, the other side needs to compromise. But, even the environmental lawyers don't see that as, but yeah, like, how much is enough? Depends on what your objective is. If your objective is not seeing a species decline in a terrible way, then enough is all that's left. But yeah, I think, really important discussions to have, and hopefully everyone will be interested in joining when we write a submission, or multiple submissions. Maybe we can do it by lab group or expertise or something.
I think expertise could be.
I can't remember the ratio, but in politics, MPs, officers, they have this kind of idea that for every one letter they get on an issue, they assume there are something like 70 people in the community who feel the same way. So
That's right.
another reason why having multiple letters helps.
It also depends on the letter. Handwritten letters are always better than an email, which is it's about 10 times. So 10 times worth of an email, and it's 10 times worth a form letter. So personalised letters are treated far more.
Handwritten, really?
Yeah, handwritten, yeah.
With a stamp pen.
Is it because they assume you're over 65?
That's what I told Queensland on Saturday night.
I can't read most people's handwriting these days.
It's because they've taken the time to write a letter they really feel strongly about this, and
Write it, print it, sign it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's not just something they've cut and paste. It's they've written it.
Yeah.
So I found people share it around the lab.
That's a great idea. Well, feel free to come and chat if you're really excited about law reform.
Yeah, it's really comfortable to see Hearing for us like your first word and to see the same kind of problems.
That's discomforting or comforting?
No, it's comfortable. But I just wonder because I work at the local government in Brazil, and there we have this kind of decentralization process. So in Brazil, environmental licenses state and federal level competence, but in some ways, like it's passing to city competence, to municipalities competence. And do you think this can be a potential solution for this auto-referred process, because maybe local authorities have more capacity to oversight of that capacity to just to be placed.
It's super interesting to see how that works in Brazil. The one example I know in Australia is they've devolved the management of our flying foxes, our really big fruit bats camps, to local councils.
Okay.
And what that's meant is that the local councils have been less compliant with the rules, and with these species, there's 4 of them, have really large, most of them have really large ranges, and they move around, and so all the local council sees 10,000 bats rock up on their doorstep, and then they all go out there and try and kill them or scare them away, and then that 10,000 bats will move to, so it's one population or, yeah, and so that's one example that it hasn't worked in Australia, but maybe, and I'd hate to think what most of Queensland would do, because Queensland tends to not be very favourable to the environment in most of the electorates, but I think in some of the more greener areas,
Yeah, pros and cons.
yeah, it would be interesting to see how that works. I know that there's a push to get environmental decision making pushed just to the state governments and not have the federal oversight, and that was deemed to be a really bad thing for the environment, because the state governments would just go crazy. Yeah, so that's the argument is we need multiple levels so that we can, yeah, keep governments in check. But yeah, it'd be super interesting to see how that might work in the general. Should let everyone go and get their lunch, but have to shut.